What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and now that we're done with Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals, we will make a full story out of that video, but I want to try something here. I want to cover at least the first issue of Ultimate X-Men just to see whether or not you guys are interested in this kind of thing, right? So, something to understand, when the X-Men are introduced into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this is likely the way in which they will be introduced to the MCU, right? I've been saying for a long time they've been here the entire time, and that they're just now being discovered. Like, the X-Men exist, Xavier's out there, he's just using his powers to block everybody's knowledge of the X-Men's existence. But the way this story opens up is it initially opens up with the Sentinels immediately going after and annihilating a cell of mutants. Now, this is one of the things that's really interesting about the Ultimate X-Men, right? This takes place in the Ultimate Universe, so it's not part of the main Marvel Universe per se, but the Marvel Cinematic Universe is basically based off the Ultimate Universe almost in its entirety. This in Earth 98 is pretty much where all this stuff comes from, where all the stuff in the MCU comes from. So one thing to know is that when it comes to the X-Men in the Ultimate Universe, they were just there one day. We never really got any explanation, at least not immediately, in terms of where they came from, how their powers developed. That didn't come until Ultimatum, and we'll probably explain that, if you guys are interested in more of this stuff. But basically, the X-Men just exist, and what had happened somewhere along the line is that the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants had launched a strike in Washington, D.C. And because mutants had striked the U.S. government so publicly, you had a guy named Bolivar Trask who basically developed the Sentinel program. And the Sentinel program being used by the government was literally assigned to basically travel throughout the United States to find mutants and then to either capture them or eradicate them, but to leave normal humans unharmed. And in fact, Magneto's the one that leads the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Now, that's one of the big differences between Magneto here in the Ultimate Universe and Magneto in the main Marvel Universe. One, Magneto in the main Marvel Universe has been around for an exceedingly long amount of time. So he's been a bad guy, at least he started out as a bad guy. He was eventually an anti-hero, and then he became a good guy and led the X-Men and then went back to being a bad guy again, right? He's kind of been back and forth and back and forth. In the Ultimate Universe, there really are no redeeming qualities when it comes to Magneto. He is a straight up tried and true villain. There's a point in this story, man, where he is nuts, right? It's crazy, one of the things that he pulls off. But the reality here is that Magneto is the most pure version of himself in the Ultimate Universe, which is to say he believes the Earth should be inherited and dominated by the mutant population, and that humanity needs to be wiped from the face of the Earth. That's his philosophy, and that's it. That's one of the things you guys are going to notice. The relationships and the purposes the characters serve are a lot more simplified in the Ultimate Universe than they are in the main Marvel Universe. It's nowhere near as complicated, which honestly I think a lot of you might really love. But following this kind of message that was sort of rebroadcast to the world because people were already aware of it, that what we end up doing is transitioning to San Diego and picking up with Hank McCoy, also known as Beast. Now that's one of the things, because the world is aware the mutants exist, they're hated, right? Everybody hates mutants. So as soon as a human discovers one, either they pick a fight or they try to kill them or something along those lines. In this instance, it's basically a bar fight, or at least a small bar fight, that breaks out between Hank McCoy and another guy. Now, of course, this guy tries to attack him. Hank McCoy overcomes him and sends him flying into a wall, and then he's told to get out by the bartender before this guy spreads his brains all over the place with a shotgun, right? So ultimately, Beast ends up leaving. That's one of the other things you guys are going to notice. Marvel doesn't really pull any punches when it comes to the Ultimate Universe. It's not Punisher Max Dark, right? But it's one of those things where it's a lot more realistic and a lot more gritty in terms of how things are depicted here, which again, I think you guys might also love. But in the midst of all this, you basically end up having Hank McCoy, who's met by a girl, and when he's kind of like, who in the heck are you? Her response is, the best thing that's ever happened, right? Like the best possibility for you. And so at that point, we switch over to Athens, Texas. Now, once they get there, of course, this girl basically, uses her powers, which we can kind of throw it out there now. It's Jean Grey, using her telepathy to manipulate a sheriff in order to have him take her to where a mutant is being held, only for us to find out that it's actually Storm. Now, the reality here is that at this point, Storm is simply just known as Aurora Monroe. She does not really have her code name yet, and that makes sense because she was always known as Aurora Monroe, like she was just called Aurora. Of course, this girl basically reveals, my name is Jean Grey. Now, here's one of the big caveats here, and this is one of the things you guys are going to notice about the Ultimate Universe as well. People are not necessarily as powerful as you're traditionally used to seeing them being, right? So like with Jean Grey in the main Marvel Universe, her telepathy and telekinesis is on a universal level. In the Ultimate Universe, she's not. In this instance, she can only control one mind at a time, right? She can't really dominate a room full of minds at the same time. Now, of course, her powers and her abilities will progress as time goes on, but in the immediate, that's really what we're looking at here. Now, of course, the other part of this is that Storm doesn't fully know how to use her powers. She's aware that she has them and she can manipulate weather, but she doesn't have total control over them. That's another big difference as well. In the main Marvel universe, when you first meet Storm, she's got total control over her powers. She's been using them for a long time. That's kind of a different shift with her character, that she's a little less experienced here. But what we end up doing is switching over to New York, where you basically have these guys that are kind of in the middle of a weapons, like an arms deal. And they're literally buying a suitcase nuke from what are basically the Russians. Now, the crazy thing about this is that in the middle of all this, it's basically an ambush. They take out all the Russians except for one guy. And once they start shooting him up and the smoke clears, this guy's got metal skin. Obviously, this is Colossus. And it's one of the coolest things, right? Now, the other part about this is that once Colossus takes these forces out, he's basically dealing with the struggle in knowing that now that his identity is public, now that people know that he's Colossus, his days are numbered, right? Because he will be tracked down by the Sentinels and they will kill him, right? Ultimately, they will. They're, when it comes to the Sentinels themselves, they were designed to be able to counter virtually any level of superpower. Now, that again is the thing to understand. In the Ultimate Universe, there aren't really any super high level reality warpers, right? So there aren't really any like Molecule Men, Owen Reese, who can alter reality on a multiversal level or anything like that. It's a lot more grounded here. But of course, he's visited by Jean Grey, and Jean Grey's like, nope, everything's cool. Welcome to the X-Men, right? Like, we have a team for you. And so what we end up doing is switching over to the Xavier Institute for Gifted Youngsters. And so the X-Men team, as it's being formed here, basically is composed of Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Jean Grey, and Beast. Now, the cool thing about this is the roster is not complete because they still have one more guy that they have to grab. But the funny thing about this is that what you end up having is them basically getting a bit of a tour of the Xavier Institute. Now, of course, as you guys will notice here, there's just people, like there's contractors, guys who are hired to paint the place and to basically make it look nice and that kind of a thing, right? To basically finish the place off. The biggest concern that you would have here is, okay, if this place is filled with humans, what stops any of them from like reporting the X-Men to the federal government? Well, Beast actually asked that question, and then he's actually greeted by the voice of Professor Xavier through a telepathic communication where Xavier says that he's basically manipulated the minds of these guys, so none of them will ever report any of that information, right? Like literally, he just uses powers on them, which really kind of shows us that at least in the Ultimate Universe, Xavier's abilities are comparable to what they are in the main Marvel Universe. He's still exceedingly powerful. But the other part of this, and this is what's really cool, in the Ultimate Universe, the costumes of the X-Men are more than just ceremonial. In the main Marvel Universe, the X-Men have had a lot of different costumes, a lot of different outfits, and in a lot of different ways, Marvel has used those to either show like a new shift in the status quo, or a new writer does it to show that it's kind of their take on the X-Men, like when Grant Morrison wrote new X-Men and gave them basically the kind of outfits that you see here. But in the Ultimate Universe, these outfits serve a practical purpose. That what they do is they actually cloak the mutant gene from Sentinels. So Sentinels won't know that they're mutants. As long as they're wearing these suits under their clothes, they can just walk around out there in the world and be perfectly fine. And Sentinels will be unable to differentiate between them and normal humans. Now, of course, once they actually meet with Professor Xavier and they start talking to him, there is a little bit of banter back and forth in terms of, is this room really considered a library if it doesn't have any books? And Xavier talking about how he just reads the minds of his favorite authors as they write their books and different things like that, right? Just not necessarily important, but designed to kind of show us the nature of Xavier himself, but to also present us with what seems to be a more just kind of calm down, chill instructor kind of guy. But the other thing about this is that we basically end up getting this sort of explanation of Xavier and Magneto and the relationship they have. Now, this is where things are really cool, and this is actually a massive differentiation between the main Marvel Universe and the Ultimate Universe. When it came to Xavier forming the X-Men here in the Ultimate Universe, the reason he did this is because at some point along the line, he and Magneto were friends. But the difference in their ideologies is that Magneto wanted to conquer the world, basically eradicate humanity, and only mutants would inherit it. Xavier was a more practical approach, as opposed to the peaceful coexistence that he's always espoused in the main Marvel Universe between humans and mutants, which is what he's striving for here. His immediate reaction to that was, no matter what war humanity engages in with the mutant population, it'll be the eradication of both species, right? Because for every step that we take forward, humans will become more and more extreme in an effort to take us out, which means we will have to become as extreme as they are, and eventually it'll eradicate all of us at some point along the line. And so because of the difference in their ideologies, Magneto had actually attacked Xavier and almost killed him, but Xavier basically fled with Magneto believing he was dead. And when that happened, he basically snuck off here to Westchester and basically formed the X-Men, right? And did it in secret, to where basically they operate behind the scenes and nobody really knows they're there. Now, kind of talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe here for a second, that really could just be the plot point, right? That like Xavier hides the existence of mutants themselves from the human population because he knows that humans will lash out, right? Maybe it's one of those things where like mutants did exist, maybe not a whole lot of them. Humanity wasn't fully aware of them. Maybe it was like a small town here and a big city there, but every time humans came into contact with mutants, they attacked them. And so what Xavier did is he used his powers to wipe knowledge of all mutants out of the minds of everybody across the world. So nobody knows that mutants are individuals that exist out there. So there's no reason for them to attack them. Now, of course, that also begs the question, if that's the case, why hasn't anybody with mutant powers used their abilities? That's like the biggest hole in that theory. You would think somebody somewhere who was a mutant would have used their powers and somebody would have said, hey, are you part of the Avengers? And they'd be like, no, I'm something else. You would have heard about their existence by now, right? So my thought in the MCU is that either it's that theory or the reality is they're just now popping up for whatever reason, right? They're literally just now coming into existence, but we don't fully know why. So the thing about this is that where the question's asked of Xavier, like how is it that he was able to find these guys in the first place? Xavier presents Cerebro. Now this is kind of a consistency actually between the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe. Cerebro, for those of you guys who don't know, this is basically Xavier's computerized device, right? This thing that he uses to scan the world regarding the entirety of the mutant population as it exists, no matter who has powers, whose powers have fully developed, whose powers have not fully developed, whether they understand their abilities or not, because remember, the machine detects the mutant gene. And as long as a person has a gene, the machine will be able to differentiate between a mutant and a normal human. But what Xavier also says is that in New York, specifically out in Times Square, that there is a young kid named Bobby Drake, right, who basically fled from his family when his powers manifested, although he doesn't fully understand how they work or is even able to control them, but he left his family under the fear of the fact that the Sentinels would find him and like his family would be killed in the crossfire. And so at the moment, he's just a homeless kid living on the street. It's a little darker of a take, but also a little more realistic in terms of how these things would function. And so what ends up happening, of course, the X-Men wearing their outfits take to Times Square and are basically on the hunt for Bobby Drake. Now, the other part of this is that there is a bit of a kind of cloaking device that basically changes their physical appearances. So they don't necessarily look the way they normally do. So they can kind of go out there, they can operate, and nobody will say, I've seen that red-haired girl before. She was in Times Square when things popped off. They don't really have to worry about that problem. The bigger issue here is that the Sentinels are also looking for Bobby Drake, and they ultimately find him on a bus. Now, of course, Beast ends up jumping in, rescues Bobby Drake, but in blowing his cover, now the Sentinels know that Beast is a mutant as well. And so at that point, either the X-Men let Beast die or they jump in to help him out, which means now all their covers are blown. Now, this again is one of the cooler aspects of the Ultimate Universe X-Men, because what you end up getting is Storm basically being asked to use her powers by Cyclops. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice here is that the X-Men are just immediately sent out into the field by Xavier. They're not really being given any traditional training. That's a big differentiation, because when you first meet the X-Men in Marvel Comics in like X-Men #1 back in 1963, that like Jean is the last mutant being brought in to join the team, and she's being given a tour of the entire Xavier Institute and is being shown like their training process, how they use their powers, that kind of a thing. So like it's a far more organized system than what seems to be going on here. Now again, this is only the first issue, so things will change as time goes on. But the reality is that Storm, using her powers, because she's so inexperienced, she is able to focus her abilities long enough to take out like 3 Sentinels, really more 2.5 than anything else. But after she uses her powers, she immediately collapses from the strain, right? She just passes out. And so of course that leads to Beast taking out one of the Sentinels and so on and so forth. And for the most part, like the X-Men basically save the day. Now, one of the cooler moments here is that you do have Cyclops who draws the attention of one of the Sentinels. And when one of those Sentinels snatches him up and then pulls him over his head, Cyclops just opens his optic beams and just annihilates this guy. But of course, where one of the other Sentinels, kind of the one half of one of the other Sentinels that wasn't completely destroyed by Storm, where they make their move against the X-Men, Bobby Drake unleashes his powers, not fully realizing what he's doing, but freezes the whole thing up, right? So obviously Bobby Drake is still Iceman in this universe. Now I say that because there are characters in the Ultimate Universe that are not the exact version of the character as it exists in the main Marvel Universe. So that's an important distinction to understand here. But a really funny thing that goes on, of course, is that as soon as the X-Men basically, rescue Bobby Drake, that ultimately they're immediately attacked by humanity, right? They're immediately attacked by the people who are there. So of course, they're ultimately forced to flee. But at that point, we switch to Magneto and the Savage Land. And what ends up going on is Magneto literally starts talking talking to like his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and recognizing that one, Professor Xavier is still alive, and two, he's formed his own team, which is kind of a counter to the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants that can work to end the efforts of Magneto. The other part of this is that the arms deal that was going down in Russia when we initially met Colossus, that was being done by Magneto. That guy, Ahmed, was basically hired to buy a suitcase nuke that could be used by Magneto for some campaign that he has. Now, we did cover a story in the Ultimate Universe called Ultimatum. That's basically when Magneto attacks the world and almost destroys it. I'll have a link to it down in the description, which you're welcome to check out after this video. It's really, really cool. But when he gets up here and he meets with Ahmed, then what ends up happening is, of course, Ahmed initially believes it's a chance for him to explain his mistake by Magneto, and Magneto's response is, no, I brought you here to make an example of you, which is why your henchmen or your guys are still here. And he asks him, do you still have a pacemaker? And the response of Ahmed is yes. And then Magneto rips the pacemaker out of his chest using his powers of magnetism, and then tells the Scarlet Witch to clean up the mess. And then it's just like, we need to find some way to destroy the X-Men. Like, Magneto's brutal in the Ultimate Universe, man. This guy's nuts. And I gotta be honest with you guys, it's the best version of Magneto in Marvel Comics. I'm not even gonna lie. The best version of Magneto in Marvel Comics is in the Ultimate Universe. It's amazing how cool his character is. But the thing about this is, initially, Quicksilver's response is, okay, well, I can move at super speed. Just tell me where, Magneto, and I'll take out Xavier. And Magneto's like, you're an idiot, man, because Xavier would shut your powers off and probably shut down your brain before you even got remotely close to his location. What we need is a person who can sneak in there, a person who can get in there, who's basically a master assassin. And so what Magneto does is he tells Quicksilver, go find Wolverine and tell him that he has a new assignment. Wolverine in the Ultimate Universe? Man, son, he's a whole different beast from the Marvel Universe, from main Marvel Comics, and he's amazing. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching. Let me know if you guys want to see more of this, and I will catch you all later. Peace.